Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly update for July 9th, 2020. I'm Kevin Gostola, managing editor for shadowproof.com. We have several stories for you to cover this week, but first, Brian.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Kevin. Good to be with you. Thank you for joining us. Just a quick reminder to make sure you are subscribed to our show on YouTube and that you follow us on Facebook and Twitter so you can keep up to date with the show and figure out when we're going live and what we're talking about. And I also just wanted to remind you that if you like this show and you want to support our reporting, you can head on over to shadowproof.com/donate, chip in a couple dollars, check out our membership program, and we'd be happy to have you help us put money in freelancers' pockets. With that being said, we have a ton of stories this week. The first one we have here, Kevin, involves Reality Winner, the whistleblower whose case you've been following very closely for a long time now. We have a COVID-19 outbreak confirmed at the prison where she is incarcerated. What is this story?
It's a horrible story, is what it is. It's what her attorneys had warned would put her in danger, and why, going back to April, they'd been asking for her to be released. And it's why other prisoners in facilities throughout the United States have demanded a release, because it's well known that the Bureau of Prisons has not taken appropriate precautions to protect prisoners, that it's extremely difficult to protect prisoners from the spread of COVID-19. And as we're seeing spikes in over 30 states throughout the country in the past week to 2 weeks, especially before the July 4th holiday weekend, we know that we are going to hear of further expanded outbreaks in these facilities. And one of them in Texas is Carswell, where Reality Winner is incarcerated. We're hearing from public health officials that they are treating this as a facility outbreak, which is remarkable because a lot of the public health departments have spoken about community outbreaks and suggested that they were able to control facility outbreaks. And in fact, this is kind of going backwards for the state, because you're having a facility outbreak later in the pandemic. And it's just inexcusable. It shouldn't be happening. And it's also partly why you've had advocates throughout the country say that there needs to be decarceration. There needs to be people released from prisons. Start with the most vulnerable and then work your way down and release people from prisons to protect against the spread. The less people in facilities, the easier it'll be for social distancing, and the easier it will be to actually protect safety. And so there are currently 68 women that have tested positive at Carswell. There are 3 staff that have tested positive. And this is unfolding as her appeal is going before an appeals court challenging the denial of her request for compassionate release. You can head on over to Shadowproof and read a full report breaking down the arguments from the government and arguments from her attorneys replying to the government. But essentially, it's my view that there's a game being played here, that the U.S. government is essentially playing a game with Reality Winner's life because they are saying things that are completely nonsense, like your medical records that you brought before the court are not up to date enough. You didn't bring forward good enough evidence to show that the medical conditions in which you suffer from actually leave you vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus. You didn't show that the medical prison is ill-equipped to handle responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The fact is, this ruling was issued by the district court without allowing an evidentiary hearing to happen where that sort of evidence could be put on the record before a judge. Also, they have the most recent medical records for Reality Winner in their custody. And so, as I can glean from reading the filings, the attorneys that represent Reality Winner put the paperwork in that they have, they put the records in that they have, but they don't have the most recent medical records at Carswell. And so that's for the government to put forward. And so those records really should probably be subpoenaed and forced into this lawsuit so that people can see the truth, that there are these conditions that that she currently suffers from that make her vulnerable to the coronavirus. So you've got that technicality, and essentially, there's this whole idea too that she requested home confinement and didn't actually make a request under the compassionate release statute, and so in effect, the administrative process really didn't start, and so her appeal was premature, and she should never have jumped forward and gone to the court to ask for some kind of intervention. And this is happening during a pandemic. There are people's lives at risk. There are even prisoners who have died. And it's the Bureau of Prisons and the Justice Department's position, which is typical and has existed before the pandemic, but it's their position that you let an administrative process unfold that will never uphold your rights, and you wait and wait and wait until you finally become severely ill and or on your deathbed, and then you might have the ability to go before a district court to get them to save you, but you're going to have to deal with the appeal, and you may even have to go all the way up to the Supreme Court to prove your case, which could take years, and you could be dead by then. Or you could be permanently damaged as a person because of what you endured from getting ill or getting cancer, something of that magnitude. And so her lawyer, Joe Whitley, wrote in the filing that this whole thing, this nonsensical theory, is emblematic of the government position regarding Reality's compassionate release request and its scattershot approach to the COVID-19 pandemic at large. And further declared, in short, because the Bureau of Prisons was not prepared for the type of pandemic, a prisoner's last and only resort is the district court. Her mother, who is very and understandably afraid for her daughter, had spoke to me, shared some of the bleakness that Reality Winner is trying to survive, and mentioned that her daughter feels she is, quote, suffering through this hell in a black hole where nobody seems to know or care what's happening to them. And it's her position that the denial of her release was wrong, that the government could have long ago saved her from the suffering that she's going through. Her and other prisoners definitely deserve to be able to obtain compassionate release. And especially for Reality, who her sentence will be over with all the good time credit she has. She would be done next year in 2021 and could go to a halfway home in the middle of 2021, and she could re-enter society. And right now, with this outbreak in Carswell, you have to imagine what it's like to be in this facility and wonder if you're going to make it to 2021.
Thank you, Kevin, and I really appreciate you staying on this. I don't think there are any other journalists really telling this story and giving this much necessary attention to what is happening at Carswell, not just with Reality Winner, but with the other folks that she is incarcerated with. So I appreciate your reporting on this, and I know you'll stay with it. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to give a quick shout to a local publication, we know that all of these local newspapers are under duress during these times. I think the Fort Worth Star-Telegram has done some good reporting on prisoners in Carswell, as well as the men's facility that had an outbreak. I think it's still struggling through an outbreak, and with the complete, total lack of transparency on the part of the Bureau of Prisons. If you're interested in what's happening with prisons in Texas, because Texas has gotten a lot of press since there's been these surges in cases, you could go to their local newspaper and read. They've talked to prisoners. They talked to Billy, her mother, and they've talked to other people who have tried to help out and get prisoners released. So I think the Fort Worth Star-Telegram has done some good journalism.
Yeah, that sounds exceptional for sure. So thank you for sharing that. We have another COVID-19 story I want to bring up here. As the cases surge, we have animal rights groups that set up a whistleblower portal for industrial farm workers. What is this story?
And so the animal rights group, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and then with the support of actor Joaquin Phoenix, they've launched this online portal for industrial agricultural workers to submit tips or information. And the site is reportanimalag.com. And my cat is joining us for this broadcast. They claim they will protect individuals' anonymity and ensure they avoid retaliation. Obviously, my cat is fully supportive of not being cruel to animals. I think that's really good. So, from the press release for ALDF, which is this group that has been one of several groups that fought ag-gag whistleblower laws. We talked about this in the past weeks. This law that is pushed in states throughout the country by right-wing conservatives in order to shut down any disclosure of evidence of corruption and cruelty and abuse that might be going on at these industrial agribusinesses. So this is from their release. It gives some of the details of why they are launching this portal. Due to the cramped working environments inside slaughterhouses, the pandemic spread quickly through employee ranks, requiring many large facilities to temporarily shut down. This created a bottleneck, leaving many animals, especially pigs and chickens, stuck at farms longer than anticipated, growing larger and older than slaughterhouses could handle or the industry desired. Industry associations and the U.S. Department of Agriculture quickly offered recommendations on depopulation, mass killing of animals on farms. Suggested methods included suffocating chickens with foam, blunt force trauma, and ventilation shutdown, which is absolutely horrible. And this was supposed to be executed by shutting down all fans and vents to enclosed barns while animals suffocate and are baked alive in rising temperatures over multiple hours. So this kind of practice, along with the fact that Donald Trump used the Defense Production Act in order to enforce and force these factories to stay open, these businesses to stay open. And so when workers were potentially going to be sent home to stay safe because of the spread at these businesses, what ended up happening is he ordered that they stay open and continue to pump out these this industrial food production that was believed necessary for the country, and so that was a risk of their safety, and also as clear here at risk to many of these animals that actually, as it seems, they've just been massively slaughtered and sacrificed in order to make it easier for these businesses to manage what they've been dealing with during the pandemic.
Thank you, Kevin. We now turn to Iowa, where we have a story involving two Black Lives Matter protesters who are facing a rare leak charge. What's happening in Iowa?
This is coming from the Associated Press, and this is a rather remarkable story. So I'll just go through different parts of the story here from the Associated Press and give some commentary. So that according to the AP, there are two protesters who are charged with unauthorized dissemination of intelligence data, a felony that carries up to 5 years in prison. So first off, unauthorized dissemination of intelligence data, I mean, that sounds like a crime that we would, or an alleged offense that would be brought against someone under the Espionage Act, like they might be working at the NSA or they might be at the CIA. But we're just talking about a police department. We're talking about the Des Moines Police Department in Iowa. And the Iowa Judicial Branch says it is only the second time that the charge has been filed since 2010, according to the AP. It's intended to punish officers and others who share information that could undermine criminal investigations or violate privacy protections. The document in question was a bulletin that officers and state troopers had with them while patrolling a July 1st protest at the Iowa Capitol. This bulletin included photos of suspects who were wanted in the destruction of a Des Moines police car during a June 20 protest. I've seen these bulletins before. Haven't you seen these bulletins, Brian?
Mm-hmm.
They're routinely released from Freedom of Information Act requests. They are, if these contain wanted photos, typically wanted photos are made public anyway because the police want help from the public in catching these alleged suspects. So generally speaking, without commenting on the specific crime, because I have no idea what really went down, although it's described in a bit of detail here in this AP story, which I'll get to it. But generally speaking, a bulletin that mentioned that they were looking for a person, I would think that would be public information that they would want out there so that the police could go use these details in order to catch the suspects. So they mentioned that Alexandria Dia, 26 years old, took this intelligence bulletin from an officer's back pocket during a confrontation between officers and protesters, which began after officers arrested 3 of the suspects inside the Capitol. This is alleged in the criminal complaint. Obviously, we can't take that as completely true, but this is the version of events that prosecutors are putting forward to go after these 2 Black Lives Matter protesters. They say then that the protesters gathered at a county jail to demand the release of those arrested during the protest. And then 21-year-old Viet Tran discussed and displayed the bulletin during an interview that was broadcast on WOI-TV, which is an ABC affiliate. The first page of the 4-page document has a notice warning that it shouldn't be shared or released publicly, and that doing so would violate Iowa code. Well, I'm not familiar with this code, but this isn't classified information. States don't have classified information, so this seems rather absurd. And even the spokesperson for the Des Moines Police Department, his name's Sergeant Paul Perizek, says that it was difficult to assess whether any harm resulted from its dissemination, which is usually the case, actually, when you see disclosures not just from, in this instance, a state law enforcement agency, but also just the national agency, any federal government agency. That's typically the case, that they can't produce evidence of harm. But the sergeant says such bulletins contain confidential information, such as driver's license numbers, that must be protected under the law. However, I'll point out here that there isn't anything mentioned in this article about the protesters reading driver's license numbers or anything related, anything remotely close to, I don't know, the kind of information that the St. Louis mayor read. Remember, in the last week or so, there was a huge scandal because she read these comments from her own residents or her own constituents, and was accused of doxing them because she read their identifying information, which is the kind of thing that the police department is saying they'd like to protect from being disclosed in this document. It's also interesting that if you read further down in the AP report, there's a section that mentions that they're not going to go after the reporter, and the reporter has a right to publish this information, and the local affiliate is unfortunately very silent about this leak prosecution. So I think that just shows you something that's very common, which is that you get silence. You get radio silence from establishment reporters or these media institutions. They should be speaking out and saying that it's unconscionable to go after people with this kind of a law. It was apparently tried one other time previously, and that case didn't succeed. It ended up that the person pled to an unrelated and lesser severe charge. But these are felonies. These are felonies that these 2 protesters are accused of. Then they could potentially end up in prison for up to 5 years. And what we're talking about here seems very frivolous, and it's clearly to make an example out of people. But I'm not really sure why they're being made an example, because it's not like they stopped the police from being able to capture or arrest any of these people involved in the destruction of a police car.
Thank you, Kevin. That's a great story. I want to dig into that after we get off this episode here. I want to turn to our next story, which also involves law enforcement. We have an Illinois cop who was put on desk duty after releasing a video of a police murder. What happened in Illinois?
Yeah, so there's in Joliet, which is actually a suburb of Chicago where I'm based. It's just, maybe like an hour out from Chicago. It may not actually be a suburb, but it's pretty close to Chicago. And his name is Javier Escueda. He was a sergeant I don't know if he still has that ranking. He may have been demoted from that title, unfortunately, but he was placed on leave and stripped of police duties, according to a local news organization here, WBEZ in Chicago. He blew the whistle on the death of Eric Lurie, who was in police custody. And CBS Chicago's, so according to CBS Chicago, he lost his badge and he's now been put on leave pending this criminal and internal investigation into what happened. They accuse him of gaining, quote, unauthorized access to a video that was being investigated by an outside agency. So again, we have, in the context of this show, a case that's very similar to some of these federal whistleblower cases that we've talked about, where someone is being accused, it seems, of like violating the sanctity of an agency, releasing secret or confidential information that they should not have. Now, what is this video? What are we talking about? It's a snuff film. I actually watched it. I saw that Benjamin Crump, a very well-known attorney who's taken on a lot of these cases, he was involved with with representing George Floyd's family and trying to pursue justice, and achieved. Ended up, I think, getting Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, to kick up the charges a notch to charge second-degree murder in those cases against the officer, Derek Chauvin. And so in this case, there's a video. It's awful. I'll just summarize what it is, basically, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about. These two officers, deputized warriors in the fight against drugs in the United States, had Eric Lurie in the back seat of a police vehicle. He seems like he's doped on something. He might have had drugs in his system. If anything, he's at least drowsy. I don't know what else he might have been suffering from, but he seemed a little bit sedated. And they open his mouth, because in his mouth he's got, I think it was fentanyl or it was some kind of drug, but he's got drugs in his mouth and he won't open his mouth and let them remove the drugs. So what they do in this video is one of the officers takes their fingers and pinches his nose so he can't breathe. And Eric Lurie sits there for 45, 50 minutes, not able to breathe through his nostrils, and his mouth is still closed. And then suddenly he's pretty much just frozen and limp. And the officer pulls the bag out of his mouth, and then Lurie falls limp over to the side in the vehicle. And the officers are now done fighting the war on drugs. They got their little baggie of substances out of his mouth. So now they can care about his well-being. And now they're like, oh, he's unconscious. And of course he is, because you plugged his nostrils and he's now dead and you killed him. And the video then ends. And so, like, it's a snuff film. There's a murder captured on camera. And this officer, Javier Escueda, is a whistleblower who should not be getting the equivalent treatment that you normally get when you're trying to help officers survive prosecution for murdering someone. I mean, he's been placed on desk duty. That's often what we've seen cops get. Instead, he should get a promotion, or he should at least be lauded. We should see public officials thanking him for releasing this video. The fact that this investigation was ongoing is not good enough reason to keep it secret. In fact, it might be that he released the video because he wasn't sure that the investigation was going to result in charges against the officers or in accountability for what happened. So this is a important story. We'll continue to follow what happens to this officer, who is clearly a whistleblower that deserves our support.
Thank you. That is a horrendous story. I appreciate you bringing it to us. In Michigan, we have the governor's vetoed a bill that would have expanded state whistleblower protections What is going on in Michigan?
And so in Michigan, we've got Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who just vetoed a bill that had an expansion of protections for any state employees. Essentially, the idea, and it seems to have been an effort led by some Republicans in the state, which is possibly why we're having this political battle. But it passed unanimously in the House and the Senate, which means it has bipartisan support, and it called for creating a new law to ensure state workers are protected if they come forward as whistleblowers about issues such as waste or mismanagement that don't rise to the level of suspected crimes. That's according to local news report in Detroit. If you have concerns about something at work that isn't criminal in nature, you don't have that protection. Why would we want to stop state employees from doing that? That's according to Republican State Senator Tom Barrett, who was one of the sponsors of this legislation. I think what we're looking at here is another instance of partisan whistleblowing, or in this case, support for partisan whistleblower protections. It seems that the governor believes that there is an ulterior motive on the part of Republicans for pushing this, and the fact that they want to empower state employees to be able to bring forward their claims of waste or mismanagement or any abuses of office that aren't really suspected crimes may mean that they want to try and stew up political scandal and have protections and use it as a way to go to war against the governor. I certainly understand from the record that we've got things like Benghazi and we've got the emails with Clinton. Certainly Republicans are very astute at creating scandal out of nothing. It's something that maybe the Democrats could learn a little bit from as far as political warfare goes, that could be used to help people at the most vulnerable people. But I don't know that it's a good enough reason to veto a bill like that. You obviously had both Republicans and Democrats voting for this legislation. It seems very similar to some of the state legislation we've talked about in other states. I remember talking about a bill that was just signed into law in Virginia by Governor Northam there. It was a piece of legislation that was supposed to give workplace protections to people during COVID-19. And I think now, with everything happening, we need more whistleblower protections. We don't need less. And if there are going to be phony cases that are brought forward, if people are going to manipulate the process, let's expose that. I'll be here on this show to say that someone's abusing the whistleblower process. But by and large, usually when a person who is in a higher office claims that there's manipulation of the whistleblower process, they usually are trying to prevent it from affecting them. And I think that there might be a good case that Governor Whitmer herself doesn't want to be held accountable for something.
Thank you. Tell us about our next story with a pharmaceutical company that's been accused of defrauding the government on effectiveness during the pandemic.
Yeah, and thank you all for continuing to watch. We have a longer show than typical. There's a lot of important stories. We've had lighter weeks where there were fewer stories, but I'll say quickly, this relates to some of the previous examples we've had of False Claims Act cases. It's essentially this law that exists, one of the few laws that exists to challenge corporate corruption in the country. It's very common and useful in having some modest forms of accountability. And so you have a pharmaceutical company named Hoffman LaRoche that allegedly defrauded the federal government out of $1.4 billion by falsely representing claims of the drug Tamiflu's effectiveness and potential in a pandemic. This is from Frontline Whistleblower News. And it's in a lawsuit, by the way, that was unsealed in September 2019. So this is before the COVID-19 pandemic that Tamiflu was doing this. It doesn't say what pandemic. I assume they were talking about a flu pandemic. The company apparently knew that Tamiflu didn't reduce the contagiousness of the influenza of influenza or prevent people from contracting it. It also apparently knew that it basically lied about the effectiveness of their drug and alleges that LaRoche fooled the government into buying tens of millions of courses of Tamiflu by misrepresenting the data on its effectiveness to the federal government as well as the public. So this is winding through the courts. It's now unsealed. We know that it is a case that is in the courts, and we can follow it. So we'll update you as, especially if there's a settlement in this lawsuit.
Thank you. We have 2 stories left, and I also thank people for sticking with us. I think we've got a great show here, though, so want to give you the time to spend talking about this. The TSA is requiring face shields now after a whistleblower complaint. What is the story here?
We actually did talk about this when it was first reported that there was a TSA whistleblower. His name is Jay Brainerd. He's in Kansas. He had complained that TSA did not train staff for the pandemic and that supervisors were stockpiling these N95 respirator masks. And they were doing so when it was hard for surgical masks to be found. So he questioned why those weren't being used or why those stockpiles could not be shared with other agencies that maybe could use them because the TSA wasn't. And there's not a lot to add here because this is a good story. This is a good whistleblower story. The thing that he's blowing the whistle on, admittedly, doesn't really threaten the structures of power. There's no excuse for failing to protect people who are TSA employees. There was apparently a meeting. This TSA whistleblower got to interact with management. There are new requirements for TSA personnel to have gloves. They're going to wear face shields. And it seems like there might be less spreading of the virus if you absolutely have to travel through an airport. So that's good. And I don't really have much more to add other than to say that it is pointed out in some of this coverage that you don't usually see this resolve as quickly as it did. But perhaps a crisis moment made TSA come clean, or again, it doesn't really threaten the power structure of the TSA. So it's pretty easy to get together with this whistleblower and say, okay, what can we do? How can we protect TSA personnel? Because the news headlines are highly negative.
Thank you. Our last story here involves Julian Assange. We have dozens of press freedom, human rights, and privacy rights groups calling for his release. What is going on with this story?
Yeah, so as we conclude, we are providing updates regularly through this program on Julian Assange's case. We've got reporting at shadowproof.com on Julian Assange. And last week, we talked about the indictment that was somewhat expanded, though there weren't new charges added. It was window dressing to put some more material in there that could aid in the character assassination of Julian Assange and basically help the government argue that he's more of a hacker than a journalist. And so while that's unfolding and while the U.S. government presses on with this case, this case that threatens press freedom, we have the fact that he remains inside Belmarsh prison, this maximum security prison in London that has had struggles with the coronavirus, like all facilities throughout the world. And he applied for bail and was denied bail earlier on during the pandemic. Meanwhile, there's been evidence put on the record that would support allowing him to be released into home confinement. And we've got these groups that have now signed on to this letter, coming from the Courage Foundation, Reporters Without Borders, the International Federation of Journalists, PEN International, the National Lawyers Guild, and several other organizations, Cage UK, you've got European Center for Press and Media Freedom, and the Index on Censorship, Article 19, Big Brother Watch. These are organizations that are European primarily, and they're speaking out for his release. And they say in their writing that this is an unprecedented escalation of an already disturbing assault on journalism in the U.S. They're referring to this expanded indictment, and they mentioned that President Donald Trump has referred to the news media as the quote unquote enemy of the people, whereas previous presidents have prosecuted whistleblowers and other journalistic sources under the Espionage Act for leaking classified information. The Trump administration has taken the further step of going after the publisher. Mr. Assange himself has been persecuted for publishing for nearly a decade. And he's had real fears. They go on to outline some of the fears to talk about his arbitrary detention, which he endured while being in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. There's a recap of what happened with the Obama administration that I won't go over again. They criticize Ecuador for the illegal termination of Assange's diplomatic asylum in violation of the Geneva Refugee Convention, and for inviting the British police to come in and arrest Assange. They criticize the fact that he served 50 weeks, a staggering 50 weeks, they write, for a bail violation. He was accused of jumping bail simply because he sought asylum in the embassy. And as they conclude, the confined persecution of Mr. Assange is contributing to a deterioration of press freedom in the UK and is serving to tarnish the UK's international image. Reporters Without Borders cited the disproportionate sentencing of Assange to 50 weeks in prison for breaking bail, and the Home Office's decision to greenlight the U.S. extradition request, as well as Mr. Assange's continued detention, as factors in the country's decline in its ranking to 35 out of 180 countries. So there's a World Press Freedom Index, and this year UK fell because of the way that they have abused and mistreated Assange in this case. So we've got this letter, another letter that we can add to various other letters from doctors and then other people who have been outspoken, demanding that at minimum, if you're not going to drop the charges, at least release Julian Assange to home confinement so that he doesn't die in prison from the coronavirus while waiting for this to unfold. And we do have a hearing scheduled for September that would continue the extradition process. But who knows if it will actually go on or not. We live in a very tenuous moment. Everything is volatile and changing. If there's a surge or spikes in cases, who knows if the court will be able to continue with a hearing that is really involved. There's going to be dozens of witnesses that are called by the defense to testify, a lot of evidence presented, and people in the court have to be able to do this safely in order to manage the hearing. They know that, and they won't want to proceed if it isn't safe for them to do so. But if they don't proceed with this hearing, then that just adds another 6, maybe 8 months to Julian Assange's time in prison before he's exonerated, or before, worse, he is sent to the United States. But all this time that just keeps going by, he just marked his 49th birthday this past week, and he has 2 children, and he's engaged, and all this time that just keeps passing by, there could be something humanely done to allow him to not have to be in prison while this is all unfolding.
Thank you, Kevin. That does it for all of our stories today. Very impressive job. Thank you for running through all of that.
And we had a cameo appearance from my cat named Bogart.
That's right.
So I just would like to give him credit, because if you were
appropriately timed
who he is, he's a wonderful foster cat. So from him to I guess to Julian Assange's dear embassy cat. We in solidarity, we put our feline friends on camera to show that we support whistleblowers and press freedom.
That's right. Although I have secreted my dog away so that she doesn't start barking in the middle of the broadcast. But are there any final thoughts, any updates, anything you want to leave people with before we wrap it for today?
There isn't a whole lot, but I do want to tease something because we're currently working on getting the member newsletter that we have regularly released to people through Shadowproof. I'm working on making that a more focused letter that will be called the newsletter that you will be able to subscribe to as a way to support Shadowproof, or as a way to engage in these stories. If you like this content, if you appreciate what you're hearing here, these will be deeper dives into the stories, even more so than what we do in this show, because writing allows you to unpack these issues a little bit more and to flesh it out, and also maybe some people would rather read than watch a YouTube show that's 45 minutes long. So this would be a compliment to the show that we're doing, highlighting articles every week. It's going to be called The Dissenter, which was the column that I started when I joined Firedog Lake, which at this moment I believe was like 10 or 11 years ago. Almost at 9 or 10 years ago that Jane Hampshire brought me on, and we launched the Dissenter, and it was a thing that we used. So we'll just call it that. I think it's an appropriate name for a newsletter that would cover whistleblowers and truth tellers, and to continue doing this kind of work that we're trying to do with this show. We know there are a few people out there that think it would be good if this was available as a podcast so that you could download it. And maybe we'll get to do that with this week's episode. It is much longer, so it would lend itself to a listening format. But if not this week, coming weeks, I think we'll roll it out as a podcast. It's something that I think we should do, because these are essential stories. And even if there are mainstream outlets that are reporting them, they don't get the mass attention that they deserve. I mean, do you know that there's an Illinois police officer that is a whistleblower this past week because there was a police murder that he exposed in a video, and officers are upset by the way he released that information? I mean, no, we don't. I didn't turn on CNN and see that reported. So I think there's a certain amount of work that we can do to compensate for the lack of attention that these kinds of cases receive. There's no, mainstream attention to BLM protesters being hit with leak prosecutions. I mean, that's insane. So hopefully this newsletter will be good, and we might be able to get some support outside of just asking members for donations that will make this newsletter more of a established part of what we do with Shadowproof. So I just give you that as a preview of what is to come. And I thank you all for your support and every little bit that you give on a weekly basis in order to make what we do at Shadowproof possible. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you want to support us, we'll make an announcement, I'm sure, a more formal announcement, and we'll provide a link here on the show when it does go live. In the meantime, if you want to support us, if you want to become a member, you can go to shadowproof.com/donate and check out the options there. And just one final reminder to make sure you're subscribing to us on YouTube. Make sure you're following us on Facebook and Twitter. Big thanks to all the folks on Facebook and YouTube who have joined us and have lively discussions in the chat. I love to see it. I really love how this community around the show is growing and people are starting to talk to each other. Fantastic. So thank you all for showing up and for supporting us. And we will talk to you next week. Thank you so much. Take care.